All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started now. Welcome to our webinar this morning. My name is Andrew and I work in marketing, and our presenter today is Ben Christensen, and he holds the credentials of QSA and CISA, and he's been here at Security Metrics for almost 3 years now, and he has a lot of experience working with organizations and helping them meet GDPR requirements. So we'll be excited to hear from him today. Again, this is the state of GDPR. So today we'll talk about some best practices that you can implement at your organization. Also, we will be talking about some of the frequently asked questions that we get in regards to GDPR. So we're excited to discuss this topic today. And also, for those of you that are interested, at the conclusion of the webinar today, we will be showing a brief demo video of our GDPR Defense product, which is a tool that you can use to meet GDPR requirements at your business. So you're welcome to stick around for that. Also, before that demo, we will be hosting a Q&A session as well. So if you have questions that come up during the webinar today, feel free to chat those in using your GoToWebinar control panel. And we will get to as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar today. If we don't get to your individual question, then we will have someone reach out to you on an individual basis in the next couple of days to make sure you get that question answered. And just a heads up, we are also recording this webinar today. So feel free to share the recording, with others in your organization. We will be sending it out to you in the next few days. Probably, beginning of next week, we'll get the recording out, and we'll send the recording to the email that you use to register for the webinar. So again, feel free to share with others. Feel free to go back and review the recording. We hope you can gain as much information as possible from this webinar today. So as we get started, we're going to go ahead and start with a poll. Just to kind of gauge our audience a little bit better today and get an idea of who we're talking with. So first, and you should see this poll pop up on your screen, we'd like to know where you're located. I imagine we have a large group from the UK, and also from the US. So if you could take just a minute and respond to that poll, and that'll give us a good idea. Thanks. Okay, just about 10 more seconds, and then I'll close the poll. Okay, thank you everyone for taking the time to answer. So it looks like we have a mostly U.S. audience with us here today, which is interesting. A lot of people in the U.S. sometimes think GDPR may not apply to them, but if you're doing business with customers from the UK, if you're storing UK customer information, then yes, GDPR does apply to you. So it's good to see that we have a good group of US people here today, and a lot of that probably has to do with the time of the webinar. The workday in the UK and in the EU is kind of ending right now. So hopefully for those people that couldn't make it today from the EU, we, like I said, we are recording this webinar, so we'll get that recording sent out to them as well. Okay, so let's go on to our next poll question here. So our next question is, how prepared is your organization with GDPR compliance? So if you'll take just a minute and answer that, and we'll be right back.
Polls are good. It's a good way to get interactivity. Rather than just sitting there, that's great.
Yeah.
And then it's obviously very, very helpful for us, right?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, take just a few more seconds, and then we'll close the poll. So, okay, looks like moderately prepared or somewhat prepared. All right, thanks everyone. So here's the results from that question. So as you can see, it looks like most of you are either moderately prepared or somewhat prepared, which is good to see. You know, it looks like some of you have taken steps to meet GDPR requirements, and you know, it looks like even 8% of you feel that you're extremely prepared. So that's great. And you know, for those of you, the 11% that say you're not prepared at all, you know, that's great too. That's why we're having this webinar, and hopefully we can help you out a little bit with some good information today. Okay, so we have just a couple more poll questions here. So next question, how important is GDPR compliance to your organization? We had some polls at the end as well. I think there was another slide.
There was another poll slide.
Okay.
But I don't remember what the polls were. But
Okay, so I'll leave.
So you can jump back in there and do that.
I'll leave the last two for the end. Okay, thanks everyone for answering that. So here's the results for that question. It looks like it's a high priority to the majority of you. Then we have, you know, 6% that are saying, what is GDPR? And, you know, it's good to see, we've got a broad spectrum of knowledge levels here today, and that's great. Hopefully we'll have information that can help, you know, everyone that's in attendance, both those that don't know what GDPR is, and then also those that are already somewhat prepared and are looking to get a little bit more information on best practices. Okay, well, we do have two other poll questions, but I'm going to go ahead and save those for the end, and we'll ask those questions towards the end, since we can, so that we can dive into the webinar now and get going. And as I mentioned before, just a reminder, we will send a recording of the presentation to the email that you used to register. So like I said before, if you'd like to go back and review this, we will be sending a recording to your emails probably beginning of next week. All right, well, at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to Ben, and he'll go over our agenda, and we'll dive into the webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, I'm really excited to talk about GDPR today. So I'm Ben Christensen with Security Metrics, and I've been working on GDPR for a little bit now. So we're going to go over some news and updates of GDPR and what's going on today. We'll go over some frequently asked questions that we get a lot, and also some best practices that we've seen that help out organizations become more ready for GDPR. So you may have seen some of these in the news and on TV a little bit about GDPR. We're talking more about that in the U.S., especially right now, with privacy concerns. But, you know, Carrefour and Warehouses was a bigger one in the U.K. that lost some records, as you can see here. And so that was kind of a big deal. I mean, you know, you look in the news every day and there's some kind of breach going on, whether it's GDPR or credit card breaches or, you know, other personal information. You tend to see that every day, and you think, oh no, what are we getting into now? But there's things going on. We can see there's been a relatively large fine, £400 there for that by the ICO in the UK. You know, so they are looking for these things, and they are going to fine people if they feel that's necessary. But as you've seen, some of these occurred back before the GDPR was effective, and so I think we'll see that those fines will be more under the old directive, but they are still looking for that, and they are going to enforce those. Google and Facebook, of course, we everybody saw that one, the huge fine and the billions of dollars there. You know, the ICO obviously is going to look for Google and Facebook, the big players, and to see what they're doing, and they're going to set the trends for how things are handled, I think, for GDPR as well. But, you know, they failed to protect users' personal information, and I think that is a big deal, and we all should be concerned about that. A lot of us, most of us, probably use Google and or Facebook, right? A hospital was fined, you know, €400 with GDPR violations. Aggregate IQ was also, they faced the ICO's first enforcement notice for GDPR. So, I mean, things are happening, right? We May 25th came and it is gone, and we're wondering what's going to happen. Well, things are happening, right? They are looking for these issues and these violations of personal data, not handling that correctly. So May 25th, it's come and gone. We were all really worried, and I think we still are a little bit. But what has happened? What's going on now? Do we still need to do anything with GDPR? Are we okay? Well, some things we found as we're looking at businesses and talking to people about privacy and data security out there is people are worried about it, and we do need to do something. Now, GDPR is I think, a good thing for the industry. From a data perspective, data or personal data user, it is a good protection to have, I think. Now, for businesses, it can be very difficult to follow, right? But from my perspective, I think it is good for industry. But GDPR the intent is to help unify privacy laws across Europe, right? And have everybody kind of on the same playing field and make sure personal data is handled appropriately. So I think that is a good thing. So who does it affect? Andrew mentioned this a little bit before, and people always wonder, am I in scope? Should I worry about this? Primarily, it's any organization operating in or across the European Union, right? That, of course, that affects them. But really, it's any organization processing personal data from EU citizens, natural-born citizens. So if you look at it, I think really the whole world could be in scope if you look at it from that broad perspective. So yeah, it does affect a lot of people and a lot of businesses. So of course, you should care because it may affect you, and you should do at least something, at least know where you stand. Because there are fines, of course. That's the scary thing, is there could be fines that are 4% of your annual global revenue, or up to 20 million euros, whatever's greater. So obviously there's a little bit of teeth there. They can fine you if they feel that they need to. So yeah, we should be aware of what's going on and where we fit in this. So what to look for, where the scope of this fits in for you, it's good to know, are you a data controller or a data processor? Data controllers are any entities that determine the means and purposes for which data is processed. And then you have the data processor. That's an entity that processes or does things on behalf of a data controller or data controllers. So which one are you? Maybe you're both. You could be both, right? Some businesses are set up to be primarily a data processor, where they're working on behalf of data controllers to process data. But they could be both. They could be a data controller for their own data, for their own employees' data, depending on the type of employees. If they're European citizens, they may be a data controller for at least those. They may be data controllers for other people as well and may not know it. So you need to know where you fit in, a data controller, a processor, or both. There's also a thing called a joint controller, actually, which you could be a data controller with another data controller as well. So it's good to know where you fit and what types of activities you're doing for personal data. So number one, know if you're a controller or a processor. So when we look at GDPR versus just general data security out there, where does GDPR fit? Well, GDPR obviously is more focused on privacy, of course, but it does encompass some basic data protection principles. It does mention being secure, right, to a certain degree. But GDPR is going to probably require a lot of additional policies and procedures and step-by-step documentation on what to do as far as personal data, and making sure your scope includes all that personal data, not just maybe your traditional network architecture that's protecting credit card numbers or other type of sensitive information. So it does play a part, but GDPR has a lot more things that you do need to look at. And people might be familiar with other things that they're regulated in, PCI DSS, SOC, ISO 27000, and many others that are more familiar with regulations and things where those fall. But again, GDPR, as we know, is more privacy focused. So what about PCI DSS specifically? We do have PCI DSS customers that we work with, and they always ask, well, if I'm PCI DSS compliant, am I good with GDPR? Am I done? Do I need to do anything else? I mean, of course, there's some things that they can carry over, some data security principles that will work, but there's a lot more to do that we found. There's just so much more to do. Your GDPR scope is much bigger typically, because whereas PCI DSS focuses on credit card numbers, it's more easy to define where credit card numbers are, and it's easier to know these are credit card numbers, these are not. Versus personal data can be so many things that points to an individual, either directly or indirectly. So your scope probably just grew a lot. So you need to make sure that you're protecting that and you're considering that as part of your scope. So some best practices that I've seen, that we've seen here at Security Metrics, as we've been talking with a lot of different folks at different entities and different providers and different merchants. Number one, I would say, you got to do your data mapping. You got to know which data you have, what type of personal data, how much personal data, where personal data is in your organization, where it goes internally, how does it come into your organization, does it flow out of your organization, and where? Do you have controls over that? Do you know where it's stored, how it's protected when it's in transit or when it's sitting there on your servers? You really need to do that data mapping to know where things are. And I highly, highly recommend diagrams, pictures, things that are easy to look at and understand for multiple people in different departments. So do that data mapping and flow diagrams to know where things are coming and going as far as personal data is concerned. And also, you got to know where your processes might have gaps. What processes do you currently have that address personal data? Maybe you don't have many. Maybe they're mostly addressing other security aspects of your organization. But making sure that you know where that data is number one. You got to know what you have to be able to then decide how to protect it. GDPR policies and procedures. So we go into organizations and people will say, well, I think I'm good. I'm not sure, but I have PCI, DSS policies and procedures. I have gone through a SOC audit. I do HIPAA. I have procedures. And again, I think those are great. I think they could be a good starting point, but you may not have GDPR specific policies and procedures. And sometimes we see, okay, they do have policies and procedures that address GDPR, but they're kind of high level. We shall do GDPR. We will do this and that, but maybe they lack how to actually do it. So step-by-step procedures, how to handle an incident or a breach. What actual step-by-step procedures should you do when a request comes in from a data subject to do something with their data? Do you have step-by-step procedures? And also, have you tested those? Have you at least run through them at least a little bit to make sure, yeah, they kind of make sense, they kind of work, and then obviously to make them better as time goes on. But having those step-by-step procedures is something I've seen that's a little bit lacking. Legal basis for processing data. Make sure you document why you have this data. Why are you using this data? And again, document it. In the audit realm, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen, or it won't happen. So you got to document everything, right? Document your basis for what decisions you've made. Why do you have personal data? How are you handling it? What processing activities are you performing? And explain it. Just document what you've done along with your data mappings and your explanations of why you have data. Just make it clear, make it so somebody can come behind you and understand what decisions you've made and why you made those decisions. Consent's another big one. That's kind of a hot topic. If your legal basis is consent, there are many. There are several different bases for having personal data, such as contracts or consent, depending on what you're doing. But if consent is your basis, make sure you're obtaining that. First of all, make sure you are getting some kind of consent to process their personal data, but make sure it's clear and easy to see and easy to know from the data subject perspective what you're doing with their data. And so they know when they click agree or sign up, they know what you're doing with it. And yes, you're clearly allowing them to give their consent. And have a clear privacy notice document or something on your web page or in an email somewhere that you can send or give to data subjects that can easily read that for more information, but again, that's clear, easy to read, easy to understand. Going along with that, privacy notices, really, I've seen some that are really long and hard to read, especially in the US when we're pre-GDPR days. You look at those things and they're really tough to read, right? And nobody reads them. They click, yeah, I need this service, whatever. Get me through to the next page and click through it. But it really shouldn't be that way. It should be, maybe it's a pop-up, maybe it's a clear text box, maybe it's an icon, maybe it's a couple bullet points that say, here's the most important things, and I'm going to clearly explain to you as the data subject, here's really what I'm doing, here's why I need the data, here's your rights as the data subject, here's how long we keep it, maybe a couple bullets, and then, hey, click here for more information, for example. Just make it super easy, super clear. I think that's the intent, is to make it super easy. Again, when you're looking at GDPR, something that helps me is to always think from the data subject's perspective, not from the business or what's going to be easy or hard for the business. It's not about that. It's about the data subject and their rights and freedoms and what's going to be good for them. So that perspective helps me understand, oh, okay, maybe I should tweak things a little bit, or here's maybe a better recommendation based on that perspective. Data subject access requests, those are big as well. When GDPR first came out, everybody, okay, the right to be forgotten, right to be forgotten. I can have somebody forget me, and that is a right? That's one of those. Are you ready to have data subjects request information or request that you don't process their data? Are you ready to delete data, remove data, or communicate with data subjects regarding their personal data? The time limit to comply with one of these is 30 days, is 1 month. So you need to have things ready. 1 month might seem like a lot, but it can go by pretty quickly if you're not ready, and if you're working with multiple vendors and processors and data controllers, that time might not be a lot of time. So make sure you have those requests documented and ready to go, and you can be really quick and ready to handle those, especially if you handle a large amount. If there's a lot coming in, that could be a big problem. So make sure your processes are efficient and they work for you, and you're ready to handle those requests as they come in a timely manner. So data protection by design and by default, that's a big one. I remember when I first read the GDPR and I saw data protection by design by default. I'm like, what does that mean? That's a big. It's like right there in the articles, and you're like that's a huge thing. If you read it, you're like, okay, check box, yeah, I'm secure. But if you really think about it, that's a lot of controls that come under that. Data protection. That to me that screams. Okay, part of that could be PCI, it could be NIST, ISO, it could be SOC, whatever those controls that you highlight in those requirements. But there's a lot of requirements, right? It's not just one requirement. There's many underneath that. So make sure you understand what that means. That is big, and it's kind of a hidden. There's a lot of controls in that one little sentence there. So that's a big deal. That's a big one. But we also recommend using data protection assessments. You may or may not need to do one based on if you're a processor or a data controller, you may or may not have to do those. But regardless of that, to support being secure by design and by default, you got to, I think, perform risk assessments. You got to perform these impact assessments to know, okay, if I change a process, if I have new data flows, whatever, how might that impact my personal data? And more importantly, how might that impact the rights and freedoms of the data subjects, that for the data that I hold on them? How might that impact them? And then, if you can understand the impacts and the controls together, that'll help you know, okay, how big of a deal is this? Well, really, what is the impact? Because I have all these controls and these safeguards. When I do this impact assessment, I have a better understanding where I sit, what my posture is, and then I can better handle and fill in the gaps and bolster my security from there. Contracts and agreements, I think, are also important. We go to companies and everybody has a contract with somebody, typically with some kind of processor or other data controller to perform some function or business deal. Make sure those contracts are clear and they include GDPR language, whatever you want to call it, that makes sure you know your role as data processor or data controller, what your obligations are with each other, who does what when an access request comes in, what about breaches if those happen, who reacts first, does the data subject call the controller, do they call you as a processor? Make sure those are clear in your contracts, and make sure that's well understood and you've really discussed those with those third parties. Because when it all comes down to it, if there's a problem, I think probably everybody's going to be on the hook, right? I don't know that the ICO or whoever is going to really care. Oh, I didn't know, I thought it was them. Just have clear agreements so that you know who's responsible for what. So overall, some security considerations, some things that we highly recommend you consider and have controls and safeguards for are these bullets here. Now, these bullets come from forensics. Our forensics team here, when they go out, these are kind of the top issues they see where people have gotten in, have breached a network, whatever. These are the kind of the top things that they've seen problems with, such as remote access. I've seen a lot of examples and heard a lot of examples of people misconfiguring remote access, or RDP is just directly accessible from the internet, and people get in and take control of your network and, therefore exposing potentially personal data and other things, right? You have bigger problems. So look at remote access. What are your flows of data and access in and out of your network? Your web application, is that secure? Are you looking at penetration tests? Are you making sure that's secure through your firewall, your edge security, your perimeter security? Is that something you're looking at? Whether you have other regulations you're following or not, that's just a basic that you need to have good perimeter security and making sure you know what's allowed in and out of your network. Wireless security, password policies, malware, physical. There's so many controls. These are just the top ones, but these are some big ones. Just make sure you have those policies and procedures in place. If you're following PCI DSS, for example, a lot of these are right in the requirements. And for other requirements, NIST, ISO, right? These are pretty standard things. So make sure you're taking care of these basic things. I think these are part of security by design and by default, right? These are some of the top things. Some other things to look at, I mentioned penetration testing. That's something you may consider. You may have to do it for PCI DSS or other regulations. That's really making sure that things are really secure. If somebody tries to get in, how far can they get? So these are good to perform. Pseudonymization, that's something that we've talked about more with GDPR. That's something you can do. Encryption, you can encrypt data. Are you encrypting personal data at rest and in transit? File integrity monitoring. Do you know when files change on your network and ones that should or shouldn't change? Do you get alerts? Do you know what's going on your network? Training personnel, I think that's a huge one. We see no matter what industry, what regulation, whatever you're trying to do, you got to train your folks, right? You got to know, they got to make sure they know what to do. And if an incident happens, what do? They got to know, they're the first line of defense a lot of times on, phishing and password issues, right? Make sure they know what they're doing, which then leads to more secure environment for your personal data. Patching, we see that. We still see it today, right? Where patches aren't managed very well and things are open and you have breaches and problems there. So, and internal vulnerability scanning. So think about these bullet points here. These are some minimum things that we highly recommend you do, and if you're not required, quote unquote, required to do, think about doing these things for your environment to make sure they're secure. It's going to help your business anyway, right? So data protection officers, we get this question too. Should we assign a DPO or data protection officer? We don't really think we need one. We don't think we fall under the requirements to have one. Regardless if you need one or don't, we recommend you have somebody in that capacity, whether you call them DPO or not, but somebody that's responsible for your compliance, for GDPR specifically. And we recommend that person, they need knowledge and support of the president or CEO, they need support from them, and they need that authority. That's really important to have that authority to carry out their role, to make decisions, to make sure you're following things for GDPR and being secure and being concerned about privacy and all of your processes and procedures. So I would consider having somebody in that role, regardless if you feel you need one or not. So data breaches, we've seen that happens all the time in the news, right? It's not a matter of if, it's when. We say that a lot, but be ready. Have those policies and procedures to detect, report, and investigate a breach. Again, whether you feel like you have a lot of data or not, that's still a good business practice to have these breach procedures. If something does happen, even if it's a false positive, what do you do? Who starts it? Where do you go? Who do you report it to if you need to? Who does what in your team? So have that ready to go, and even just as important, I think, test that plan. Does it work? Does it make sense? If at least do a tabletop exercise, run through some things, making sure that works. Reporting data breaches is obviously a big part of GDPR. If something happens and it fulfills certain requirements, you need to report that potentially to authorities and to data subjects within a timely manner. So have those ready to go. Because if you don't have that ready to go, you again could go back to that. Well, you might have a fine or have issues from those authorities, right? If you didn't respond in a timely manner or give justification for that. Now, I am not an attorney. I say that a lot to my clients. I am not an attorney. We always recommend you seek legal counsel, either your own legal counsel or outside counsel. We're experts in data security and things, and we can help you a lot with that. But always at the end of the day, talk to your legal counsel to make sure, does this work? Does this sound good legally and from that perspective? So if we've gone over a lot. If you remember anything, just remember a few things. Have your documents ready to go, your GDPR efforts ready to go, at least something. Start with something, what you're doing, what your roles are, have those ready to go, and do that data mapping. If anything, just do a data mapping and know where you have personal data. If you don't do anything, at least do that, know where it's at. Then you can make decisions on, do I need to do anything or not? Where do I need to focus my efforts? Perform those risk analysis and gap assessments of knowing, okay, how good are we? Are we in a bad position? How much data do we have floating around our organization? And if you process large amounts of data, really consider doing maybe more. Maybe like, I know I have a lot of data. I really need to do more. I need to make sure I feel comfortable with GDPR, and make sure I feel like I'm ready for it. And in the end, just don't ignore it. Don't say, well, I'm not going to do anything. At least know what you have to do or don't have to do. Do that data mapping. Know what you've got. Talk to somebody. We're willing to talk to you and just at least go through some things with you to see where you're at and where you need to go. And especially from a data security perspective, what are some things you've done and what are some things you may still need to do. But we recommend don't ignore it. Do something. Document your decisions and what things you need to do going forward. And I think I'll turn the time over back to Andrew to have some polls, and then we'll do some questions after that.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Some really good information in that webinar, and we had a few questions come in as well, so we'll get to those in just a minute. Just to wrap things up here, we want to end with a couple more polls. So first question here, what other mandates are you trying to comply with? So we'll give you just a minute to answer that. We'll be right back. Okay, another few seconds and then we'll close that out. All right, so it looks like almost all of you are working to comply with the PCI DSS. So that's awesome. Looks like we have a good number of you working to meet HIPAA requirements as well. So that's great. And then one final poll here. Are you planning to use a third party to help you meet GDPR requirements? Okay, just a few more seconds on that. All right. So it looks like many of you will be taking care of it yourselves in-house. And then a good number of you are also interested in looking to hire someone to help you. So that's awesome. And the percentage of people responding with what is GDPR has gone down since the beginning of the webinar. So that's good. All right, so we're going to go ahead and dive into our Q&A now. Thanks everyone for taking the time to answer those questions. So feel free to chat in some questions and we'll answer as many of those as we can. And then we will launch into our GDPR defense demo, which is about a 4-minute video demo that we can share with you. So for those of you interested in a third-party resource, this could be something of interest to you. So we'll be back in just a minute to answer your questions. We'll give you a minute to chat those in. All right, thanks everyone. We've got some good questions coming in here. To start things off, we had a question about data collection. How does it differ between data collected for the purchase of a product and data in general when someone visits a website with session storing? Obviously, we need the user's data and information for sales and business records. Is that something the user has the right to ask us to delete? So that's our first question, and I'll turn it back over to Ben to answer that.
So thanks for the questions. First of all, I mean, there's going to be a lot of different scenarios and questions that are going to be very specific to your environment. And as GDPR is new, some things we're not sure, right? We don't know how it's going to shake out, how it's going to end up. But that's a good question. I think from like a data, again, from a data subject perspective, I go to a website, I purchase some goods and services, whatever. I put in my name, email, things you typically would expect to purchase a product, and you have information on that. I think that's more clear cut that, yeah, they probably can ask you to stop processing that, to delete that. But your question is more interesting to the session data. So first of all, is that session data unique to them? Does it kind of identify them? Is it personal data? First of all, does it directly or indirectly identify that person somehow with I don't know, session IP, certain information that's in those logs. And if so, then yeah, possibly that they could ask to have that deleted, all personal information on them. I would say if you're not sure, document your reasoning of why or why not you're doing certain things. But yeah, I mean, the intent is that they can delete, that's their information, anything that identifies them directly or indirectly, and that is their information, so to speak, and they can request that be removed. So document the type of information you have and in what scenarios things will apply, how you would delete that, what type of data. If you feel that it can't be deleted, maybe a justification for that, but I'd be real careful just to make sure that you may need to delete that data. So yeah.
Awesome, thanks Ben. So reading over the questions here, we've had a couple people ask about the new California initiative. It sounds like it's similar in some aspects to GDPR, but maybe you could give us a little bit of background on California's new data privacy law and how does it differ from GDPR?
So the new California law, it is, that's a big topic in the news too, where we're in the U.S. I think we see it coming. Personally, I think more data privacy regulations probably are needed. That's just my own personal opinion, and we think it's coming, right? Again, it's from the data subject's perspective, it's probably a good thing. Business perspective, probably difficult, right? But with the California law, I know it's new and it's a little bit out. I think there are some similarities to the GDPR, and as far as I think they looked probably to the GDPR to copy a little bit of that, and again focus on the data subject and their rights and their freedoms there. So I don't know all the specifics. It is a new law, and that's something I haven't gotten into yet of all the various differences and specifics, and I haven't done a mapping or anything like that with GDPR. But I know that you're going to have to look out for that, and other states may pass those same type of regulations, right? And then in the end, we may be looking more of a GDPR type regulation here, where you're going to have clear-cut policies and procedures and consent and privacy notices that are better than we've had in the past. And so I think GDPR is going to help us prepare for those regulations. So I don't know if I directly answered your question, but I would look for those and use GDPR to help you, I think, be on the forefront of those new regulations coming out.
Awesome. Well, Ben, we've had a few questions come in about data controllers and data processors. How do you determine if you're a data controller or a data processor? How are they treated differently? And also, if you could maybe give an example of each.
Okay, so let's start with the definition. That kind of helps. I always go back to the language of the regulation to help me, and then I kind of try to hopefully figure out the intent there a little bit. But so data controller determines the means to process the data, right? They have control over that, determining the means and how they're going to process data. So and then a processor would be somebody that acts on behalf of a data controller. So let's give a couple of examples. Data controller, an easy example is your own employees in your organization. You are the data controller for your own employees' data because you determine the means and how you're going to process that data, and you need it for this and that for your employment records, and you've got to have these records for insurance, and you've got to, et cetera, et cetera. You're determining what you need to have that, why you have that data. And processor might be somebody you use for your HR or accounting database, a third party that you say, will you please issue checks or deposit money into the bank account? Here's their personal information you need to fulfill this request. Please do that for us. So they're doing it on behalf of you. And so you need to make sure which one do you fall under. Am I a processor? Am I a controller? Am I both? So that's how I think of those. Just make sure you know which one you are, and you could be both.
Okay, awesome. Okay, a lot of good questions coming in right now. We've had a couple of people ask about data mapping. If you could talk a little bit more about that, for example, where do people start with data mapping? And then also, are there templates for data mapping to kind of help people get started?
So data mapping, I would say, is probably the most important thing to get out of this webinar, right, is starting with the data mapping, and it's key. For any regulation, to have proper security in any kind of environment, you need to know what you have. So data mapping, you can do it in many ways. Maybe some simple steps that I've used are, maybe first is you send out a survey to your organization and say, where do we have personal data? Or where do we have credit card if you're doing a credit card one, but where do we have personal data? And here's the types of personal data we're looking for. Maybe you meet with department heads and say, here's personal data that I'm concerned with. Where do we have it? And start making a list, a spreadsheet of here's the department, here's the data that they have. Maybe do it per department. Some people may do it per process. Here's all our business processes. And underneath each process, go and interview department heads, personnel, IT personnel, development personnel, management, and people, boots on the ground people to say, where's the data? So you could do it from that perspective as well. You may want to do it from both perspectives to make sure you don't miss anything. So really start with, I think, interviewing people, asking the questions in each department of who has personal data. Then from there you can start getting maybe containers of data. Okay, I have stuff in AWS, I have stuff on my accounting server, and then you start listing these out. And then from there, I start drawing pictures and doing a diagram of, okay, let's make this, okay, here's a box over here, here's my AWS stuff, here's my local network with personal data. And then I start breaking it down even more. Okay, within that AWS, here's the types of personal data I have. So just trying to break it down into the pretty granular bits of information of what types of personal data, where it is. And then again, with that diagram, I'm huge on pictures. It's really easy to see and understand that picture, I think. So start then drawing it out, literally with a flow diagram, with lines and arrows of where things are going. And then I would just build on that. And I think the key is working with different members of your company and your organization to more fully understand. And you're probably not going to get it perfect the first time. I would say you're not. Start start anywhere and just make it bigger and better as you go along. And then I would recommend every year at least refining that as things change, add to it, and make sure you're assessing those data points.
Awesome.
And I think part of it was a template. I think we do have certain things we can help folks out with. We can say, hey, here's some examples of maybe a starting point for data flows, data mappings and flows and diagrams. So we do have some things we can point you in the right direction on that.
Awesome. And that kind of leads into our next question here. We've had a few people ask if security metrics specifically has templates for things like policies. We had someone ask about templates for docs that can help evaluate GDPR readiness. Someone else asked about, like a GDPR checklist. But really, the question is, what tools do security metrics? What tools does security metrics offer? Do you have templates? Do you have, policies and procedures? Those kind of things.
Yeah. So the short answer is yes. We do have templates and policies and procedures and templates of those that are a good starting point that we have developed that talk about things of your general GDPR kind of overall security policy or GDPR policy of, we shall do GDPR and here's the components. They help you define, your controller or processor, things that help you map data points out, things that can help you document legal basis and the different types of personal data you hold. So we do have things that can help. And again, it's a starting point. You don't have to use all of it. You can use what you want, but we do have things available. Because like we found in other regulations, it's kind of helpful sometimes to give people that haven't done it before just a good starting point, right? And then you can make it better, modify it from there. So yeah, we definitely can help with that.
Yeah. And yeah, as I mentioned, we'll be showing an example of that in just a few minutes here. So stick around for our demo. We'll show you a little video about kind of what we offer and the templates that we have. So another question here, Ben. You mentioned design by default earlier in the webinar, and we had a question about which article in the GDPR is the design by default that you were talking about.
Article 25, that was data protection by design and by default, and it talks about that a little bit more and having the controller and different parties have appropriate technical and organizational measures, right? So it does talk about that a little bit, but you'll find that it doesn't explain what that really means, and you kind of just have to divine and know what that means. And I think we, as security metrics, we know what that means. We have a good idea of how to design something securely and by default. So we can definitely help you with that. But Article 25.
Okay, we had another good question come in. Is there a central location where someone could look up which third parties have completed their GDPR compliance correctly? If we are in purchase mode of a third party, we would want to know that they are GDPR compliant. So I guess the question is, Is there somewhere where I can go and look and see where, who's GDPR compliant and who's completed the requirements correctly? As far as like a central location where you as a company can go and look up if other companies are GDPR compliant, there isn't that specifically, so that is not available. But if you as an individual organization, if you are working to meet GDPR requirements, we do have a checklist that we can provide to you, so that you at your organization, you can go through, make sure that you're hitting all the requirements and checking off everything that you need to do. So as far as for your organization, yes, we can provide you with the checklist to make sure you're meeting everything. For other companies, if you wanna look up another company and see, are they GDPR compliant? The answer is no, right? There is no official compliance certificate, or there's no official GDPR certification. It's different from the PCI DSS, right? PCI, you can obtain certification from the PCI Council. With GDPR, they currently do not have that. That's not to say they couldn't have something further down the road, but for now, it's really up to the individual organizations to make sure that they're meeting those requirements. Well, we've got time for just a couple more questions here, and then we'll dive into the demo. But we had a question about what constitutes personal data. If we just have a unique ID for the customer without their name or personal information, does that have to be managed in the same way?
Yeah, so let's go back to that conversation about what is personal data. So let's start with the definition again. Again, my methodology, I just go back to the definition. Let's all read that together, make sure we understand. Personal data is anything that directly or indirectly identifies an individual. So, does a unique ID uniquely identify an individual, even without their customer name or whatever? I mean, does it directly or indirectly identify them? So maybe you could, the answer is it depends, right? Now, if you only have the ID that doesn't mean anything to anybody and it's separate from those others, could you somehow put those back together and then okay, it's Bill Smith? Or is there no way to recombine those to make sure that you can, identify that individual? So it's all about identifying directly, again, or indirectly that individual. So I think if you can do that, then the answer is yes. If you can't, document why you believe you can't and why it's good and you don't feel that it's personal data. It would be my recommendation. Of course, always when you're making decisions like this, document your business reason, your justification, and why you came to such decisions. And I would highly recommend, legal counsel's involved in any of this because it's highly legalese, right? So just make sure they look at these kinds of decisions. But that would be my personal take is, well, can you do it or can't you? And here's my justification for it.
Okay, awesome. So we've had this is probably our last question just due to time constraints. But again, feel free to keep chatting them in. We will have someone reach out to you on an individual basis in the next few days to get your questions answered. But we've had a couple people asking about how is the EU regulating GDPR? And then someone else asked, what about U.S. companies? Have any U.S. companies been sued, right, or fined successfully for non-GDPR compliance? So maybe, Ben, you could speak a little bit to the enforcement of GDPR.
So, and again, that's a little up in the air. I think there are some bodies like the ICO and the supervisory authorities and each member state and their courts and systems there who's going to be the ultimate authority. So, I mean, we know what's happening, right? We know that people are getting fined. We know Google, Facebook, different companies like that are on the radar and have fines right now. So we know it is happening and they are enforcing it. Those fines have been through like the ICO, I think, at this point. I think they're one of the, you can consider, I think, one of those authorities. But yeah, we'll see, right? I don't know how else that's going to work. We haven't had a lot of things go to court or in the system there to see, well, who's really going to do all this, and does the ICO have the manpower to do this, and what about each member state? Can they do it on their own? I don't know. We don't know. I don't think we know. So we'll have to kind of see. But yeah, there is some enforcement happening. We've seen it, and I think it will continue.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we're going to take for questions for today. Thank you all for participating and for asking those questions. Some really good questions coming in. We're going to go ahead and just pause for just a minute here and get our demo ready to show. This will be a demo of our GDPR defense tool, which can be used to help you meet the requirements. As I mentioned, there's templates for policies and things that you can use. So stick around for just a minute and we'll be back with that demo for you.
This is the GDPR defense checklist. We also have PyScan is included in the GDPR defense package, and you also have a reports tool. So the GDPR defense checklist comes with 4 different sections. You have the company information section, you have the data mapping section, you have the data policy section, and you have the data security section. You'll see here in the upper right-hand corner, there is a % complete. So as you go through and complete your checklist, it will be recorded up there and displayed as well. When you first log into GDPR Defense, you'll see the GDPR Defense Checklist Adherence Assessment, and that will talk to you about what GDPR is, just quickly, and you'll also get a quick understanding of what GDPR Defense is and set your expectations for the product. The first section is the company information. So those are 6 questions that are outlining exactly what size your company is. Does your organization do regular business monitoring? Does the organization conduct business in more than one EU member state? And so forth. Those are yes/no questions. There is no wrong answer. Then you can move on to your checklist. This is the data mapping and tracking section. How to complete this section? Each checklist item is intended to be marked when the requirement is in place and completed. You're not required to upload documentation, however, it is highly recommended as proof of implementation. As you're going through your checklist, we have identified terms that may be confusing. So you can just hover over personally identifiable information and you will see the definition. You can also click on how to implement. That's the data flow analysis tips. And you'll receive an outline on how to implement your data flow analysis. Once you have a data flow analysis in place, you can upload that document. However, it's not required, but recommended. Okay, once you've implemented your checklist, you will have, it'll indicate that that has been completed with a date. And then you can go through the rest of the checklist. You have the data security section. There are 4 sections in data security. You can go through and mark those complete. Once that's done, there is an attestation page that you'll see that will let you know that you have completed your checklist, and then it will be reflected in your percentage complete to 100. You can also view your reports page at any time and see that 65% is implemented or what is not implemented. You can also track how many documents you've uploaded to the portal. We do have a View Expanded section. This allows you to see all the changes that you've made historically to your checklist. This helps you to avoid willful neglect. In order to access your Security Metrics GDPR Fundamentals training course, you go into your Litmus platform. Click on your GDPR Fundamentals course. Click on Preview Course. Okay, now I'm going to click on GDPR Fundamentals, and it will take me into my training course. Here you will see the privacy and the GDPR. You have your introduction section, the general data protection section, the small mistakes global impact, compliance matters, identifying personal data, and then you can move into your GDPR principles. There's a glossary here of the courses that you'll go through: individual rights, global transfers, privacy by design. So here's an example. Once you get into your course, this is the privacy and GDPR.
The personal details that define lives, identification number.
There's audio that you can listen to as you go through your course, or depending on your time, you can read through that at your own leisure. Once you get through the course and are completed, there is an assessment. There's 10 questions that will go through and test you on your knowledge of the course information. And the courses are meant to be taken as often as you'd like, but they are good for 1 year. Here's where you'll access your assessment, and you can go through and complete those 10 questions. Once you are completed with the assessment, there is a completion certificate validating that you have taken the training on the day and the time. Part of GDPR requires businesses to update and expand their policies and procedures to meet new regulations, such as data subject rights, consent, data retention, and breach notification. Rather than trying to build your own GDPR policies and procedures from the ground up, we provide templates that you can easily tailor to your business. This is the GDPR breach notification policy template. Each of the templates begins with an instruction for using this document section. You can replace all instances of customer name that are highlighted in red and go through and fill out your company's specific information. All notes indicated by the red text can be removed, and you can fill out tables 1, 2, and 3 as they apply with the appropriate information. You can delete this page when you're finished. Here's an example of the policy itself. Here you would make edits as it's highlighted in red and mentions company name below. I'm just going to scroll through so you can get an idea of what that will look like in your document. Anything highlighted in red you can update with your company's information. As always, if you have questions, feel free to contact our technical support for assistance. GDPR requires you to complete an entire data flow map of your business's environment, including what data goes inside and outside of your business. This is a template to help you identify where information is being collected and stored. These policy and procedure templates are included in our GDPR Defense Plus package, or can be purchased on their own. This concludes our demo of our GDPR products. If you have any questions about our product, please send an email to support@securitymetrics.com. If you need to request a quote for GDPR Defense, you can contact our sales agents at compliance@securitymetrics.com. Thank you.
As you can see, GDPR Defense, it's our tool that we have that really lays everything out in a very easy to understand checklist. And it makes it easy for you to make sure that you're not leaving any gaps, right? And as mentioned in the training, upon completion of the training, you do receive a certificate that says you completed the GDPR training course. Now, this is not by any means any sort of official documentation for GDPR compliance, right? It's not like an official document from a GDPR regulatory body, but it is something that you can have to show that you are, taking steps to meet GDPR requirements and that you are doing something, right? And at the end of the day, that's really what's most important when it comes to GDPR is that, you're working towards meeting the requirements and that you're taking the steps necessary to meet these requirements. So again, if you'd like more information about this tool, please reach out to us. You can send us an email at compliance@securitymetrics.com. You can also visit our website, securitymetrics.com. We have a GDPR page where you can learn more information. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and end the webinar. It looks like we're ending right on time. We were able to keep it to an hour, which was our goal. So thanks everyone for joining us today, and we'll hope to see you next time. Thanks.